Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great? Good. So if you've spent any time around military surplus collectors or armchair historians, there's a reasonable chance that you've come across some tall tales being told that sound reasonable on the face of it, but once you start looking into them, they'll probably make you raise an eyebrow. Aside from the big myths about wars themselves, there's a lot of little myths when it comes to small arms in those wars. And today I'm going to look at 5 myths that people continue to repeat as gospel, despite the fact that, they just don't make any sense, even counterintuitively. Anyway, let us begin. Is there any better sound than that of an M-block clip being ejected from an M1 Garand? Absolutely wonderful. Until it got you killed, that is. Alright, so the myth generally goes like this. American soldiers, typically in the Pacific Theater, were being engaged in a firefight with the enemy. All of a sudden, one of the Americans fired the last round out of their rifle, and the sound of an M-block clip pinged over the battlefield. And like a flock of birds wheeling in the sky, the Japanese would turn their attention to that single American and either pour fire down on his position or charge him. Except it's nonsense. Now, if you want a thorough debunking of this myth, I would strongly suggest you go over to the Bloke on the Ranges channel. He's done a number of videos concerning this. I've linked to one of them in the description below. That said, here's why I argue it's a myth. First of all, there's not a single primary source from the Second World War, either in the Pacific or in Europe, that the ping was actually directly attributed to causing anyone's death. Second of all, it's hard to believe in the din of battle that sound would be enough to alert someone, tens of meters away that somebody was out of ammunition, or be able to, locate where that sound came from. I've read accounts from American soldiers in World War II that they didn't even hear the ping of their own rifle once they were out of rounds. Third, if it was so well known, why didn't we ever hear Americans using it as a trick, tossing an empty M-block clip onto the ground in order to draw enemy soldiers in? The reality is that it does not take very long to reload an M1 Garand using an M-block clip for someone who's experienced with it, and anyone dumb enough to charge a position based on hearing that sound would have found out very quickly how bad of an idea that really was. Would it surprise you that there is a Japanese equivalent to the ping story? It's not as well known as the ping of death, but milsurp people have probably heard it, and it still continues to have legs, despite the fact that it's even more hogwash than the American counterpart. So there is a fair number of Type 38 and Type 99 Arisakas in North America, most of them bringbacks by soldiers after the Second World War. Now, if you've only ever seen a few of them in person, it might surprise you to find out that the rifles actually have a dust cover, like this one here on my Arisaka, and here it is. Now, many of the bringbacks don't, however. And that spawned the story that Japanese soldiers battling Americans or Chinese or Brits or whomever would ditch the dust cover because it is a bit rattly, as you heard. Fearing detection by their enemy at an inopportune sound. So that's nonsense for several reasons too. First of all, on every military rifle issued in Japan, there is something popularly known as a mum, or chrysanthemum, which is the symbol of the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito at the time, which essentially signified that the rifle belonged to him. You may have also heard that the Emperor, at the time at least, was essentially a living god to the Japanese. So for the story of a Japanese soldier casually, tossing away a dust cover to be true, you would have to believe that that average soldier would throw something away that was entrusted to him by a god. Does that sound plausible? It shouldn't. Okay, let's be honest. Not every Japanese soldier believed that Hirohito was a god. Just, almost all of them. For those who, didn't believe it, there was an equally powerful and, in parts beloved and feared force in his life, and that was the non-commissioned officer. Now, anyone who has ever served in the military probably has felt or seen the fury of an NCO if their kit was not up to snuff. You ever watch Full Metal Jacket? You would get Sergeant Hartman so fast for tossing away military equipment, if not charged, and it was World War II in the Japanese. Here's the truth. The Americans who brought back the rifles ditched the dust cover because of that rattle. That's it. Blame the greatest generation. Blame Joe Biden. Whoever you want. But the average Japanese soldier did not toss away a dust cover. It's mid-April 1945, and the first forces of the Soviet Union enter Berlin to begin weeks of inhuman fighting, street to street, house to house, room to room, to finally put an end to the Nazi regime. Among them are members of the 1st Belarusian Front, armed with a new prototype rifle called the SKS-45 to test in battlefield conditions. Photographs and first-hand accounts claim the rifle's presence in the city as the Sovs gradually pushed back the fanatical defenders. Well, except for one thing. No one has ever produced a picture or even a first-hand testimonial of an SKS-45 being in Berlin before the end of World War II. That's because it wasn't. At least, like I said, not during World War II. Now, some months back, I actually did do an entire video devoted to this never-ending myth, so I'm not going to go too deep in the weeds on this. You can actually watch the video, link in the description below, but I'll briefly go over why this story is hogwash as well. Now, there are some elements of truth to the story, sort of. Members of the 1st Belarusian Front, second-line units, did field test an SKS rifle during the war, but it was the SKS-31, and it was nowhere near the front, let alone Berlin. There were field tests of the SKS-45, but that didn't begin until January 1945, with a few prototype examples in testing grounds in and around Moscow. Significant numbers of the rifle weren't produced until essentially after the war for actual extensive testing. Now, as I said in that video, many people claim to have seen photographs of Soviet soldiers in April and May 1945 in Berlin with SKS-45 rifles. None of these people are actually able to ever produce the photograph when asked. There are also no first-hand accounts. I said in that video, and I'll say it here, if you have connections inside the Russian Ministry of Defense and can produce any field reports showing testing of that carbine in Berlin during the war, you'll be a star. Well, at least in the military surplus community. It's December 1950, and the war in Korea has been grinding on for 6 months, and Americans now suddenly find themselves in frigid winter conditions. Suddenly they hear bugles, and thousands of North Korean soldiers begin their latest human wave attack. It would be almost impossible for an American soldiers to miss hitting someone out of the sea of humanity that's in front of them. And they didn't. But many North Americans didn't drop. In fact, many of them kept coming after ostensibly being hit. Very quickly, the Americans figured out what was happening. Their M1 carbines, so beloved by the troops in World War II, was unable to penetrate the body armor that the Norks were wearing in this new war. Body armor? Yes, friends. The frozen clothes of the North Koreans were wearing were enough to stop the powerful .30 carbine round. Yeah, except it's hogwash. It's been proven in testing over and over again that heavy clothes, the kind that the North Koreans were wearing, weren't actually capable of stopping a .30 carbine round. But what was happening? Well, there's a couple of theories, but I think the most plausible one is the American soldiers who claim to have been hitting North Korean soldiers and not killing them weren't actually hitting what they were shooting at. And here's why I think so. So after World War II, the soldiers that tended to be stationed in Japan during the occupation were kind of end-of-the-war, post-war recruits. A combination of rushed 1945 or somewhat indifferent post-war training and inexperienced soldiers came together to create, well, bad shooters. In the initial stages of the war, many of the soldiers sent to Korea were basically raw recruits. They were bolstered by lifers and hardened World War II veterans. I've always believed that the ones complaining about the ineffective bullets were the guys who couldn't actually shoot. And it didn't help that Pacific-serving Marines during World War II did complain that the .30 carbine did have issues with barrier penetration and would sometimes be deflected by heavy vegetation. That's hardly endemic, though, to the .30 carbine round itself, as hunters today in heavily forested areas can tell you all about, the deflection of heavier caliber rounds due to vegetation, let alone something like the M1 Garand's, hopped up pistol caliber round. One day, perhaps this winter, I'm going to test this myth out for myself, but I've long believed that the North Koreans weren't actually bulletproof. Just a lot of Americans couldn't shoot. Besides, how the hell do you run if your clothes are frozen solid enough to stop 110 grain bullets? Okay, I thought this myth was dead and buried under its sheer stupidity, but I actually heard it being repeated fairly recently by someone, so apparently it still has legs. And it involves the M16 rifle and its body-shredding round, the 5.56 millimeter cartridge. If you're not familiar with the myth, back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the brain trust of the United States military was calling for a new rifle to replace the M14, they had a special requirement for the high-tech wonder that was to become the M16. It should spin bullets out of the barrel in a manner that would shred human flesh, but not actually kill its unfortunate target. Kind of like an ammo version of a Don Rickles joke. So that's the gist of it. For decades, it's been kind of passed down that bullets coming out of an M16 barrel were designed to spin in flight so that when it struck the human body, it would create an even bigger wound channel, incapacitate its target, and then require one or more people to drag that unfortunate wounded soldier off the battlefield for medical treatment. 2 or 3 people for the price of 1 bullet. It's a deal that you can't pass by. Except, of course, it's nonsense. What people are essentially describing with a spinning bullet is one that hasn't been stabilized by the rifling of a rifle's barrel. Here's how it's supposed to work. Without getting too deep in the weeds on ballistics, when a bullet travels down a barrel, it engages the rifling, which is simply lands and grooves in kind of a twist pattern. And it begins to spin then. Now, when it exits the barrels, it still has the spin that's been imputed on it by the rifling, and that's designed to stabilize the bullet and promote accuracy. So what happens when your typical bullet isn't stabilized in flight? Well, it's actually what we refer to as tumbling, although the myth calls it spinning. As the bullet tumbles in flight, air resistance on it starts to act differently. Now, instead of the bullet uniformly piercing the air, as rifling is intended to do, the bullet actually, now that it's tumbling, air resistance on it acts differently depending on what's facing forward at that moment. And obviously, as it's tumbling, different parts of the bullet are facing forward in that micro moment. That means that the path that the bullet takes is actually now more unpredictable. So you're probably asking, well, how unpredictable? My answer is, it's unpredictable. Some years back, I had a rifle that had a damaged bore, one of the reasons why a bullet would start tumbling as it exits the barrel. And at just 50 yards, I sometimes missed paper about the size of a human torso that I was shooting at. Now, the entire point of shooting a rifle that you have, or at least hope to, is consistent results, given that all other variables are the same. A spinning or tumbling bullet can't have consistent results when it comes to accuracy. And if you can't hit your target when you shoot at it, then it doesn't matter if the bullet leaves holes the size of a basketball in it. Of course, that's only one half of the myth. The other is the nonsense that wounding an enemy is preferable because it takes him and at least another person out of action. I even heard this one when I was in the service. No, you want them dead. A wounded enemy is capable of recovering and re-entering the battle or war at a future point. Not to mention, they might not be wounded enough to stop shooting back at you. Dead, and they have the habit of not coming back and contributing to the enemy's strength. Here's another reality. If half of your platoon is wounded, the other half doesn't just stop fighting to drag off, your chums. You may have a medic out there to render aid, but in the heat of a firefight, the guys are basically trying to win. And also take a look at Cold War Soviet doctrine, for whom the M16 was, designed to engage about wounded men on the battlefield. Ivan wasn't told to drag Sergei in the middle of a firefight. It was keep your hands on your AK-47, keep shooting at the enemy. That's it. So no, the M16 was not designed to spit bullets that spun in the air in the hopes of, ripping men to pieces but not killing them. And no, that didn't happen in the theory that wounded men ate up resources immediately. All rifled bullets fly straight in the air, and at least in war, with the hopes of killing another person quickly and immediately. At any rate, that's my list of my personal top 5 small arms myth. Agreed, disagreed, have similar myths that annoy you. You are in luck, my friends, because there's a comment section down below where you may leave your thoughts and comments on that. And you can register all manner of outrage. At any rate, I hope you found today's video at least vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope you have yourself a great day, and may all of your shots ring true, especially if they come out of an M16. Take care, and bye-bye.